Kindness isn't always pure. Sometimes it's the mask we wear to hide the parts of ourselves we're too afraid to face. Jung knew this better than anyone. Stop scrolling, because what I'm about to tell you will completely change how you see yourself and everyone around you. If you've ever wondered why the kindest person you know suddenly snaps, or why you feel exhausted from being good all the time, or why helping others sometimes leaves you feeling empty inside, this is for you. Most people get this wrong, but let me show you the right way to understand human nature. We've been taught that kind people are just pure, that they don't have dark thoughts or impulses. That's a lie. And Jung proved it over a century ago. If you're someone who prides yourself on being compassionate, who always puts others first, who avoids conflict at all costs, I know exactly what you're going through. You're not just kind. You're suppressing something massive. And that suppression is creating what Jung called the shadow. The darkest, most powerful part of your psyche. Let me paint you a picture. Think about that friend who's always there for everyone. The one who never complains, never says no, never seems to get angry. Now imagine them one day, completely losing it over something small, like a parking space or a forgotten birthday. Everyone's shocked because it came out of nowhere. But it didn't come out of nowhere. It came from years of pushing down every negative emotion, every selfish desire, every moment of anger until the dam finally broke. Carl Jung spent his entire career studying this phenomenon. He discovered that the kinder you try to be, the more you have to repress. And everything you repress doesn't just disappear. It goes into your unconscious mind, forming what he called the shadow self. This shadow is made up of all the parts of yourself you've decided are unacceptable, all the impulses you've trained yourself to ignore, all the darkness you pretend doesn't exist. Jung wrote that everyone carries a shadow, and the less it is embodied in the individual's conscious life, the blacker and denser it is. Think about that for a second. The more you deny your darkness, the darker it becomes. It's like trying to hold a beach ball underwater. The harder you push, the more force builds up, and eventually it's going to explode to the surface. Here's what makes this even more intense for kind people specifically. When you build your entire identity around being good, helpful, and compassionate, you create what Jung called an ego ideal. This is the perfect version of yourself that you're constantly trying to live up to. The problem is you're human. You have needs, desires, anger, jealousy, selfishness. But these things don't fit your ego ideal, so you shove them down into the shadow. Let me break down exactly why the kindest people carry the darkest shadows, and I'm going to show you signs you might not have recognized in yourself. Don't miss point 7, because it's the one that explains why truly kind people sometimes become the most destructive. Number 1. The perfectionist trap. Kind people often hold themselves to impossible standards. You're not just trying to be good, you're trying to be perfect. Every time you have a selfish thought, you feel guilty. Every time you want to say no, you override that instinct and say yes instead. Every time you feel angry, you smile through it. This creates an enormous gap between who you really are and who you think you should be. Jung explained that this gap is exactly where the shadow lives. The bigger the gap, the darker the shadow. And here's the thing, when you're constantly performing kindness, constantly suppressing your authentic feelings, you're not actually being kind. You're being controlled by fear. Fear of being seen as bad, fear of rejection, fear of not being loved. Think about someone like an elementary school teacher who's patient and kind with 30 kids all day, never raising her voice, always encouraging. Then she goes home and screams at her own children over minor things. That's not hypocrisy. That's the shadow. She's been holding back frustration all day, and it has to come out somewhere. Jung would say, that shadow always finds a way to express itself, and it usually happens with the people closest to us, because that's where we feel safest letting our guard down. Have you noticed this pattern in your own life? The moments when you're most kind to strangers but most irritable with family. Number 2. The empathy overload. Kind people are usually highly empathic. You feel other people's emotions deeply. You pick up on suffering around you, and you want to fix it. This sounds beautiful, but here's what nobody tells you. When you're constantly absorbing other people's pain, you have nowhere to put your own. Jung understood that empathy without boundaries creates a dangerous situation. You start taking on emotions that aren't yours. You process other people's trauma through your own nervous system. And because you're kind, you think this is noble. You think this is what compassion means. But you're actually creating a massive shadow filled with unprocessed pain, resentment, and exhaustion. Research shows that people with high empathic concern who don't balance it with self-care experience something called compassion fatigue. This isn't just being tired. This is your shadow growing so large from carrying everyone else's darkness that you lose yourself completely. You become a walking wound, and ironically, you can't help anyone anymore because you're barely functioning yourself. I've seen this with healthcare workers, therapists, social workers, and just everyday people who can't say no to helping. They give and give until there's nothing left. Then they either burn out completely or they snap. And when kind people snap, it's often devastating because they've been holding back so much for so long. The shadow doesn't care about your good intentions. It demands to be acknowledged. Jung wrote that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. Meaning if you don't deal with your shadow internally, it will manifest externally in your life, usually in ways you can't control. Number 3. The anger you won't admit. This is huge. Kind people have anger. Deep, intense, powerful anger. But you've been taught that anger is bad, that it makes you a bad person. So you've spent years, maybe decades, pushing down every moment of frustration, every feeling of rage, every impulse to scream or fight back. Jung discovered that anger is one of the most common shadow elements, especially in people who pride themselves on being peaceful, kind. The anger doesn't go away just because you ignore it. It sits in your shadow, growing, festering, waiting. And here's what's terrifying. Repressed anger often comes out as passive aggression, chronic illness, depression, or a sudden explosive rage. Think about those news stories where neighbors say about a violent criminal, "He was always so quiet and nice, we never saw this coming." That's the shadow taking over. That's years of repressed anger finally breaking through in the most destructive way possible. Jung warned that the shadow can overwhelm a person's actions when the conscious mind is shocked, confused, or paralyzed. Now, I'm not saying every kind person is going to become violent, but I am saying that if you're kind, and you've never acknowledged your anger, you're in danger. The anger will find a way out. Maybe it shows up as migraines, maybe as sarcastic comments that hurt people, maybe as self-sabotage where you unconsciously destroy the good things in your life because you feel you don't deserve them. A client once told me she prided herself on never yelling at her kids. She was the calm mom, the patient mom. But she noticed she was constantly getting into car accidents, minor ones, nothing major. When we explored her shadow, we discovered massive amounts of repressed rage toward her own mother, toward her husband, toward her life circumstances. The accidents were her shadow's way of expressing the violence she wouldn't let herself feel consciously. Have you ever noticed physical symptoms showing up when you're suppressing emotions? Number 4. The people pleaser's prison. Kind people often become people pleasers. And this is where the shadow grows exponentially. When you base your worth on making others happy, you lose touch with your own needs, wants, and boundaries. Every time you say yes when you want to say no, you're feeding the shadow. Jung explained that the shadow forms partly from societal conditioning. As children, we learn quickly what behaviors get us love and acceptance. If being kind, quiet, and helpful gets us attention and approval, we keep doing it. But we're not being authentic. We're performing. and everything that doesn't fit that performance. Selfishness, the neediness, the desire for recognition, goes into the shadow. People pleasers develop shadows full of resentment, bitterness, and a secret belief that they're being used. But they can't admit this consciously because it conflicts with their identity as a kind, giving person. So they smile and help and give, all while their shadow is screaming that they're being taken advantage of. This creates what Jung called a precarious unity between the ego and shadow, where you're constantly on the edge of collapse. I know someone who volunteered for every committee, helped every neighbor, never missed a birthday. Everyone loved her. She loved being loved. Then one day she had a breakdown and moved to another state without telling anyone. Just vanished. Her shadow had grown so heavy with unexpressed needs and boundaries that the only way she could deal with it was to run from her entire life. Wait until you hear number 8, because it reveals why kind people often attract toxic relationships. Number 5. The projection problem. Here's something fascinating that Jung discovered. The qualities you most despise in others are often the qualities you've repressed in yourself. This is called projection, and kind people do it constantly without realizing it. If you're someone who prides yourself on being selfless, you probably judge selfish people harshly. If you're patient, you might be extremely critical of impatient people. If you're generous, you might look down on people who are stingy. But here's the twist. The intensity of your judgment reveals your shadow. Jung wrote that the psychological rule says that when an inner situation is not made conscious, it happens outside as fate. What he meant is that your shadow will project itself onto the world around you. You'll see in others what you can't see in yourself. And you'll react with disproportionate emotion because you're not actually reacting to them. You're reacting to your own repressed traits. Think about someone who's obsessively kind and helpful. They might have zero tolerance for people who set boundaries or say no. They'll call those people selfish or cold. But really, they're projecting their own repressed desire to set boundaries. Deep in their shadow is a part of them that wants to say no, that wants to be selfish sometimes, that's tired of helping. But that they can't admit it, so they attack it in others. This creates a warped view of the world. You surround yourself with people who need you because that fits your identity, but you secretly resent them. You avoid people who are confidently selfish because they trigger your shadow. Your relationships become about managing your shadow rather than genuine connection. Number 6. The martyr complex. Kind people often develop what's called a martyr complex. You suffer for others, and you wear that suffering like a badge of honor. You sacrifice your time, energy, money, and well-being, and part of you believes this makes you special, virtuous, superior. But here's what Jung would say about this. The martyr complex is often the ego's way of avoiding the shadow. By focusing on how much you give and how much you suffer, you don't have to look at the parts of yourself that are selfish, angry, or wanting. You get to feel morally superior while your shadow grows heavier. The dangerous part is that martyrdom often comes with hidden expectations. You give and give, but secretly you're keeping score. You're waiting for recognition, gratitude, reciprocation. When it doesn't come, the shadow erupts. You either explode in anger or collapse into depression, wondering why no one appreciates you. Jung explained that the shadow contains not just negative traits but also positive ones that have been repressed. For martyr types, the repressed positive trait is often self-worth that doesn't depend on sacrifice. Deep down, you don't believe you deserve love unless you're suffering for it. That belief is in your shadow, and it's running your life. I've seen this pattern in parents who sacrifice everything for their children. Then when the children grow up and become independent, the parents fall apart. Their entire identity was built on being needed, on suffering for their kids. Without that role, they have to face their shadow, all the unlived life, all the repressed desires, all the self-worth issues they've been avoiding through martyrdom. Number 7. The hidden superiority, this one is hard to admit. Kind people often have a secret sense of superiority. You look at people who are openly selfish, aggressive, or boundary-setting, and part of you feels better than them. You think, at least I'm not like that. At least I care about others. At least I'm a good person. This is your ego defending against the shadow. Because if you admitted that you also have selfish desires, aggressive impulses, and need for boundaries, you'd lose your special status. You'd be ordinary. And for someone who's built their entire identity on being kind and good, ordinary feels like death. Jung warned about this. He said that the conscious mind can become monarchic, meaning it dominates everything and refuses to acknowledge anything that threatens its narrative. When you identify completely with being kind, any evidence of your unkindness gets pushed into the shadow. And the shadow grows not just with your darkness, but with your denied humanity. The irony is that this hidden superiority makes you less compassionate, not more. You can't truly empathize with others' struggles if you're secretly judging them for having the very traits you've repressed in yourself. You can't offer genuine help if you're doing it partly to maintain your sense of moral superiority. Your kindness becomes a performance, a way to avoid facing your shadow. This is the one most people overlook. Have you ever caught yourself feeling superior to less kind people? Number 8. The toxic relationship. Magnet. Kind people often attract narcissists, manipulators, and energy vampires. This isn't random. This is your shadow at work. Jung would say that we attract what we need to integrate. If you have a massive shadow filled with repressed selfishness, boundaries, and anger, you'll unconsciously seek out people who embody those traits. On the surface, you tell yourself you're helping them, fixing them, being patient with them. But on a deeper level, you're living vicariously through their expression of traits you won't allow yourself. They get to be selfish and demanding. They get to have boundaries and say no. They get to express anger. All the things in your shadow. The relationship becomes a toxic dance where you enable their behavior because it lets you experience your shadow secondhand without taking responsibility for it. They act out what you won't let yourself feel. And you get to maintain your identity as the kind, patient, understanding one while your shadow gets fed through their behavior. But here's the devastating part. These relationships will slowly destroy you. Because while you're busy managing someone else's dysfunction, your shadow is growing. All the resentment you can't express, all the boundaries you won't set, all the anger you keep swallowing, it's building pressure. And eventually, you'll either lose yourself completely, or you'll have to face your shadow. Jung explained that the shadow sometimes overwhelms a person's actions, especially when the conscious mind is shocked or confused. For kind people in toxic relationships, that moment often comes when they finally realize they've been used, that their kindness was exploited, that all their giving meant nothing. That's when the shadow takes over, and the kind person becomes capable of actions they never thought possible. Number 9. The creativity block. Here's something surprising. Jung believed that the shadow is the seat of creativity. All that repressed energy, all those denied impulses, all that darkness contains tremendous creative potential. But kind people often can't access their creativity because they're so busy suppressing their shadow. Think about the greatest artists, writers, musicians. They're not known for being conventionally kind and agreeable. They're known for being complex, sometimes difficult, often controversial. That's because they've learned to work with their shadow. They channel the darkness into creation rather than repressing it into nice behavior. When you're focused on being kind all the time, you cut yourself off from the raw, messy, uncomfortable parts of yourself that fuel authentic creativity. You can't write a powerful story if you won't acknowledge the darkness in human nature, including your own. You can't paint something moving if you're afraid of your shadow. You can't create anything real if you're busy maintaining a perfect facade. Many kind people feel stuck in their lives, like they're going through the motions but not really living. That's because real living requires integrating your shadow. It requires being willing to be messy, imperfect, sometimes selfish, sometimes angry, fully human. Jung called this process individuation, becoming whole by accepting all parts of yourself. The blocked creativity isn't just about making art. It's about living creatively, making authentic choices, expressing your true self. Kind people often live prescribed lives, doing what they think they should do rather than what they actually want to do. That's the shadow stealing your life force, your vitality, your unique expression. Number 10. The exhaustion that won't quit. If you're a kind person, you probably feel tired all the time. Not just physically tired, but soul tired. Exhausted. In a way that sleep doesn't fix. That's because maintaining your persona, your mask of constant kindness, while suppressing your massive shadow requires enormous energy. Jung explained that the psyche is always seeking balance. When you create a one-sided conscious identity as a kind person, your psyche has to work overtime to contain the shadow. It's like running two separate operating systems simultaneously. The conscious you that's smiling and helping, and the shadow you that's seething and depleted. This exhaustion often manifests as chronic fatigue, brain fog, lack of motivation, or depression. Doctors can't find anything physically wrong, but you can barely function. That's your shadow demanding attention. It's saying, stop performing, stop pretending, stop giving from an empty cup. But you can't stop because being kind is who you think you are. So the exhaustion continues. The tragedy is that kind people often push through the exhaustion, adding more commitments, helping more people, trying harder to be good. They think they're being noble. They think they're doing the right thing. But they're actually making it worse. They're compounding the shadow with more repression, more denial, more performance. Jung wrote that the meeting with oneself is at first the meeting with one's own shadow. The shadow is a tight passage, a narrow door, whose painful constriction no one is spared who goes down to the deep well. For kind people, that passage feels impossible because it means admitting you're not who you thought you were. It means accepting that you have needs, limits, darkness. Number 11. The illness connection. This gets really serious. Unexpressed shadow material often manifests as physical illness. Jung worked with many patients whose chronic illnesses improved dramatically once they began integrating their shadow. The body keeps the score, as they say. What you don't process emotionally gets stored in your physical body. Kind people who never express anger often develop tension headaches, TMJ, neck and shoulder problems, digestive issues. People who never set boundaries often have immune system problems, because symbolically, boundaries are how your body knows what belongs and what doesn't. People who never acknowledge their needs develop chronic fatigue, autoimmune conditions, mystery illnesses. This isn't about blaming yourself for being sick. It's about understanding that your shadow affects your entire being, not just your psychology. When you repress enormous amounts of emotional material, your body has to carry it. And over time, that burden creates physical breakdown. I've worked with people whose health transformed when they finally gave themselves permission to be angry, to say no, to be selfish sometimes. It's like their body could finally relax because it didn't have to hold all that repressed shadow energy anymore. One woman's chronic pain disappeared after she ended a relationship where she'd been playing the endlessly patient, understanding partner while secretly resenting everything. The pain was her shadow trying to get her attention. Don't miss the next point, because it's about the moment everything can change. Number 12. The breaking point. There comes a moment in every kind person's life where the shadow can't be contained anymore. Jung called this the nigredo, the blackening, a period of darkness and chaos where the old identity breaks down. For kind people, this one often looks like a breakdown, a crisis, a complete collapse of who they thought they were. Maybe it's triggered by one more person taking advantage. Maybe it's a health crisis. Maybe it's waking up one day and realizing you don't recognize your own life. However it happens, this moment is terrifying. Everything you've built your identity on suddenly feels fake. The kindness feels like a lie. The helping feels like codependence. The selflessness feels like self-abandonment. Jung understood that this breaking point is actually necessary for growth. He wrote that every descent is followed by an ascent. The breakdown of your persona, your mask, is what opens the door to your shadow. And facing your shadow is the only path to becoming whole. But here's what's crucial. This breaking point can go two ways. You can either integrate your shadow, which means accepting and incorporating the repressed parts of yourself, or you can merge with your shadow, which means being overwhelmed and controlled by it. Jung warned that merging with the shadow is dangerous because then you're no longer acting from consciousness. You're possessed by the very darkness you tried to deny. Integration means saying, yes, I am kind, but I am also capable of selfishness. Yes, I care about others, but I also have needs. Yes, I avoid conflict, but I have anger and it deserves expression. Integration means becoming more complex, more nuanced, more human. It means giving up the fantasy of being perfectly good and accepting that you're beautifully flawed. This process takes courage. Jung knew from personal experience that the time of descent can last years. It requires genuine strength to face what you've been running from your entire life. But the alternative is worse. The alternative is living a half-life, exhausted, resentful, sick, disconnected from yourself. Number 13. The power of integration. When kind people finally integrate their shadow, something remarkable happens. They don't become less kind. They become more authentically kind. Because now their kindness comes from choice, not compulsion. They help others because they genuinely want to, not because they're afraid of being seen as bad. Shadow integration gives you access to your full self. The anger becomes healthy assertiveness. The selfishness becomes self-care. The desire for recognition becomes honest communication about your needs. All that energy you were using to repress your shadow becomes available for actually living your life. Jung wrote that assimilation of the shadow gives a man body, so to speak. It makes you solid, grounded, real. You stop being one-dimensional. You stop performing. You become someone who can genuinely connect with others, because you're no longer hiding half of yourself. Integrated, kind people are the most powerful because they know their capacity for darkness, and they choose light anyway. They're not naive about human nature. They're not pretending evil doesn't exist. They've looked at their own darkness and decided, consciously, how they want to show up in the world. This is what Jung meant by individuation, becoming who you actually are rather than who you think you should be. For kind people, this often means becoming less agreeable, setting more boundaries, saying no more often, and, paradoxically, being more genuinely helpful because you're helping from a place of fullness rather than emptiness. Number 14. The projection reversal. Once start integrating your shadow, something fascinating happens with projection. Remember how you used to judge people harshly for traits you'd repressed? That starts to reverse. You begin seeing your own shadow in everyone, and instead of judging them, you develop genuine compassion. Jung believed this was one of the most important aspects of shadow work. When you accept your own capacity for selfishness, anger, jealousy, you can finally accept it in others. You stop dividing the world into good people and bad people because you understand everyone contains both. You become more tolerant, more patient, more forgiving, not because you're performing kindness, but because you genuinely understand the human condition. This doesn't mean you accept abusive behavior. Shadow integration actually makes you better at setting boundaries because you're not afraid of being perceived as unkind. You can say no without guilt. You can protect yourself without shame. You can walk away from toxic situations without agonizing over whether you tried hard enough. The projection reversal also improves your relationships dramatically. You stop attracting people who need you to be their savior. You start attracting people who want genuine partnership. Your relationships become more balanced, more authentic, more fulfilling because you're showing up as your whole self, not just the acceptable parts. Number 15. The collective shadow. Here's where it gets even bigger. Jung didn't just talk about individual shadows. He talked about the collective shadow, the darkness that entire cultures repress. And kind people often carry not just their personal shadow but pieces of the collective shadow too. If you're someone who feels the pain of the world, who's devastated by injustice, who can't stop thinking about suffering you see on the news, you might be taking on collective shadow material. You're processing humanity's darkness through your own psyche, and it's too much. No individual can carry the collective shadow. That's a recipe for complete breakdown. Jung explained that the collective shadow manifests in things like war, prejudice, systemic injustice. These aren't just political problems. They're psychological problems. They happen because collectively we deny our darkness, project it onto others, and then attack it. Every genocide, every war, every hate crime starts with shadow projection on a massive scale. As a kind person, you probably want to fix these collective problems. But you can't fix the collective shadow until you've integrated your personal shadow. You can't heal the world's darkness while denying your own. The most powerful thing you can do is your own shadow work, because that creates ripples that affect everyone around you. When you integrate your shadow, you stop participating in collective projection. You stop seeing groups of people as all good or all bad. You become someone who can hold complexity, who can see nuance, who can work for justice without demonizing others. That's the kind of consciousness the world desperately needs. Number 16. The spiritual bypass. Many kind people get involved in spirituality, meditation, self-help. This can be beautiful, but Jung warned about what he called spiritual bypassing, using spiritual concepts to avoid psychological work. You meditate to feel peaceful, but you're really just suppressing uncomfortable emotions. You practice gratitude, but you're using it to deny legitimate pain. You embrace forgiveness, but you're skipping over anger. Spiritual bypassing is the shadow wearing a spiritual mask. It looks enlightened on the surface, but underneath there's still massive repression. You collect spiritual ideas, like weapons against your darkness. You use them to maintain your identity as a good, evolved person. But you're not evolving. You're hiding. Jung had deep respect for genuine spirituality, but he insisted that spiritual development had to include shadow work. You can't transcend what you haven't integrated. You can't forgive what you haven't acknowledged. You can't love everyone if you haven't accepted your own capacity for hate. The spiritual path that skips the shadow isn't spiritual, it's another form of denial. Real spiritual growth means descending into your darkness before ascending into light. It means the dark night of the soul, the time in the wilderness, the journey to the underworld. Every genuine spiritual tradition includes this descent. But modern spirituality often wants to skip straight to the light. Kind people are especially susceptible to this because darkness feels so incompatible with who they think they are. Number 17. The gift of the shadow. Here's the beautiful paradox Jung discovered. Your shadow, all that darkness you've been running from, is also your greatest gift. Hidden in the shadow are not just repressed negative traits, but repressed positive ones. Creativity, passion, power, authenticity, joy. All these can be buried in the shadow if they didn't fit your role as the kind, quiet, helpful person. Many kind people have repressed their ambition because they thought it was selfish. They've repressed their sexuality because they thought it was improper. They've repressed their power because they thought it was aggressive. They've repressed their joy because other people were suffering. All of this goes into the shadow, and reclaiming it transforms your life. Jung believed the shadow was essential for wholeness. You can't be a complete person with only your acceptable traits. You need access to your full spectrum of humanity. The darkness gives depth, the light gives direction. Together, they create a life worth living. The process of shadow work often reveals talents and desires you didn't know you had. That anger you've been suppressing might actually be passion waiting to be channeled. That selfishness might be healthy self-advocacy. That darkness might be the very thing that makes you interesting, complex, real. Number 18. The relationships transform when you integrate your shadow. Every relationship in your life changes. Some relationships will end because they were based on you playing a role, being the helper, the fixer, the eternally patient one. When you stop playing that role, people who were using you will leave. And that's okay. That's necessary. But other relationships will deepen in ways you never imagined. When you show up as your whole self, including your darkness, you give others permission to do the same. Conversations become more honest. Connection becomes more genuine. Love becomes more real because it's based on truth, not performance. Your relationship with yourself transforms most of all. You stop being at war with parts of yourself. You stop using so much energy to maintain your persona. You can finally relax into being human with all the messiness and complexity that entails. This self-acceptance is what Jung called the union of opposites, the sacred marriage between your light and dark. Family relationships often improve dramatically once you integrate your shadow. You can finally set boundaries with parents without guilt. You can say no to siblings without fear. You can show up authentically instead of playing the role they assigned you in childhood. Some families won't like this. They'll want you back in your box. But your job is to live your truth, not manage their comfort. Number 19. The creative emergence. Remember how I mentioned the shadow is the seat of creativity. Once you start integrating your shadow, creativity explodes. All that repressed energy becomes available for creation. You might suddenly want to write, paint, dance, make music, start a business, change careers, travel, anything that lets you express your full self. This creative emergence isn't just about art. It's about creating your life authentically, making choices based on your actual desires rather than what you think you should want. Designing a life that reflects your whole self, not just the acceptable parts. This is terrifying for kind people because it often means disappointing others, breaking expectations, being selfish in ways you have never allowed yourself. But Jung would say this is essential. Individuation requires you to separate from collective expectations and become your unique self. For kind people, this often means becoming less kind by conventional standards but more authentic by deeper standards. You might help fewer people but help them more meaningfully. You might give less but give from a place of genuine fullness. The creativity that emerges from shadow work has depth that surface creativity lacks. It comes from having wrestled with darkness, from having integrated complexity, from having earned your wisdom through suffering. This is the kind of creativity that actually contributes something meaningful to the world. Number 20. The final truth here's the truth that Jung discovered and that the kindest people need to hear. You are not good or bad. You are both. You are light and shadow, saint and sinner, angel and demon. And that's not just okay. That's human. That's beautiful. That's whole. The kindest people carry the darkest shadows precisely because they've been trying so hard to be only light. The bigger the persona of perfect kindness, the bigger the shadow of denied darkness. This isn't a flaw in your character. This is how the psyche works. It always seeks balance. Your path forward isn't to become less kind. It's to become more honest. To accept all of yourself, including the parts you've deemed unacceptable. To integrate your shadow so that your kindness comes from wholeness, rather than fear. When you do this, your kindness becomes more powerful because it's real. Jung believed that the shadow holds the key to individuation, to becoming who you're meant to be. For the kindest people, this means accepting that you're beautifully flawed, powerfully imperfect, deeply human. It means giving up the exhausting performance of constant goodness and embracing the messy reality of being alive. The world doesn't need more people pretending to be perfect. It needs more people willing to be real. It needs people who've done their shadow work, who've faced their darkness, who've integrated their complexity. It needs people who can be genuinely kind because they've accepted their capacity for unkindness and chosen differently. If everything I've described sounds familiar, if you've recognized yourself in these signs, don't panic. This is good news. Awareness is the first step toward integration. Jung wrote that to become conscious of the shadow requires recognizing the dark aspects of the personality as present and real. That recognition is what you're doing right now. The journey of integrating your shadow won't be easy. It will challenge everything you think you know about yourself. It will require you to face uncomfortable truths, feel difficult emotions, and let go of the identity you've built your entire life around. Jung knew this from personal experience. He went through his own dark night lasting years. But he also knew that every descent is followed by an ascent, that the only way out is through. Start small. Notice when you're performing kindness versus genuinely feeling it. Pay attention to your resentments. They're signposts pointing toward your shadow. Observe what qualities you judge most harshly in others. That's projection showing you what's in your shadow. Give yourself permission to feel anger, to be selfish sometimes, to set boundaries, to say no. Find support for this work. Shadow integration is hard to do alone. A good therapist, especially one trained in Jungian psychology, can guide you through the process. Books can help. Jung's own writings, though dense, are profound. Modern teachers like James Hollis, Robert Johnson, and Marion Woodman have made Jung's ideas more accessible. Most importantly, be patient with yourself. Shadow work is a lifelong process, not a weekend workshop. Jung understood individuation as the work of the second half of life. It takes time to integrate what you've spent decades repressing. You'll have setbacks. You'll backslide into old patterns. That's normal. That's part of the process. Remember this. Your shadow isn't your enemy. It's the lost part of yourself waiting to come home. It's the fullness you've been denying yourself. It's the energy you've been using to maintain a facade that could be used to actually live. Your shadow is your power, your creativity, your authenticity waiting to be reclaimed. Carl Jung spent his life exploring the shadow because he understood it was the key to psychological wholeness and, ultimately, to human evolution. He believed that individuals who integrate their shadows contribute to the collective consciousness in ways that ripple out beyond their personal lives. When you do your shadow work, you're not just healing yourself. You're helping heal the world. So, if you're one of those kind people carrying a dark shadow, I want you to know something. You're not broken. You're not bad. You're not failing at being good. You're human. And your willingness to face your shadow, to integrate your darkness, to become whole, that's the bravest, most compassionate thing you can do. Not just for yourself, but for everyone around you. Tell me in the comments which sign resonated with you most. And if you're ready to learn more about shadow work, about Jung's psychology, about the journey toward wholeness, hit that subscribe button. Because your journey of self-discovery, of becoming who you actually are, beneath all the performance and pretense, that journey has just begun. And I'll be here to walk it with you, shadow and all.